On February 28, 1993, the world saw reports of a shootout in Waco, Texas between a religious cult called the Branch Davidians and the ATF, leaving several dead and more injured on both sides. The news played images that captured a botched ATF raid, becoming a full-blown Rambo-style exchange of lead and the desperate attempts to save the wounded. When the dust settled, each side blamed the other for firing first, and no one knew how things would play out. Being just 6 months earlier, the Ruby Ridge siege was fresh on the minds of the American public. Many couldn't help but draw a comparison, and people wanted to see how this would end. Day after day, more people watched for updates on the situation, putting the poor negotiation skills and the cruel tactics being used by the FBI on full display.
911, what's your emergency?
There are 75 men around our building.
Okay, just a moment.
Hello? Hello? Yeah, this is Lieutenant Lynch. May I help you? Yeah, there are 75 men around our building, and they're shooting at us in Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel? Yeah, tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off. All right, hello? I hear gunfire. Oh, shit. Hello?
David?
I'm here.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that those that have mounted guns, okay? I'm not disputing the fact that there might have been fire from the helicopters.
The roar of the FBI noise machine. Critics suggest it only annoys.
Some people say, gee, you're irritating them. Well, that's a shame. We're irritating. They're irritating us.
Playing it during the so-called religious holiday for the cult is meant clearly as an insult.
As more became known about the Branch Davidians and their leader, David Koresh, the guitar-playing, beer-drinking preacher who was shot in the initial shootout, a sympathetic curiosity grew among the populace.
Would you use a gun if somebody came in here? They come in here with a gun and they start shooting at us, what would you do? Tell me, be realistic. This is America. This is not Australia. This is not Europe. This is not where a country overthrows a bunch of people, takes away their weapons so that the people cannot argue any issues.
The Waco siege was America's guilty pleasure programming for almost 2 months. And on the 51st day of the standoff, the FBI began to use their tanks to poke holes in the compound and pump in CS gas. For hours, the news cameras rolled as tanks poked holes in the building until at least 77 Branch Davidians died in the conclusion of the Waco siege on April 19, 1993, including 25 children and 2 pregnant women. Who was David Koresh? Who are the Branch Davidians? Why did the ATF come for Koresh? And what happened during those 51 days?
I'm back with another astrological case study. This one is on David Koresh. David Koresh, dark-sided Leo, narcissist, leader, target. More about the target in a minute. Now, this astrological case study has been sponsored by Kawaii Honey. So thank you, Kawaii Honey, for sponsoring this astrological case study. And I have to admit, it took me a while because I was kind of in the dark about the whole Waco incident and David Koresh's life. So I spent some time doing some research. I watched a few documentaries. I even started watching this made-for-TV movie about the Waco disaster or tragedy. So I'm actually going to play a few clips from this good video that I found last night. It's on the channel Manic Cadence. It's a really good channel. Check out the whole channel because there's some really good true crime stories that he presents. So I'll be sharing some clips of that as I get into this astrological case study. So here's David Koresh's chart. He was born August 17th, 1959, 8:49 a.m., Houston, Texas. As you can see, he's a Libra rising. He has his North Node in Libra rising. He has some significant energy in Virgo with Mars, Venus, and Pluto. He has a stellium in Leo, including his Sun, Aries South Node, Moon in Chiron and Aquarius. His Saturn is at the Aries point of Capricorn, which is very significant, and I'll get into that in a minute. He also has Jupiter and Neptune in Scorpio in that second house, intercepted in the second house. So before we get into the actual story, let me just present some of the dark-sided Leo traits. So David Koresh, you can basically say, was a dark-sided Leo, and here's some of the traits of a dark-sided Leo that he displayed. Egotism, narcissism, and vanity. Bossy, domineering, philandering, a need for constant validation or adoration, hypersexual. That Jupiter in Scorpio contributes to that hypersexual nature he had. Can become violent when losing control. Childish, will put himself before children even. Prejudice, superiority complex. Foolish, risk-taking. All right, with that being said, I'm going to pull up an article dealing with this story on David Koresh. This is from the biography website. So let me just share my screen. And then after that, I'll get into the actual case study where I talk about his chart. Co-leader David Koresh led the Branch Davidians in a deadly 51-day standoff against the FBI and the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Now, before I get into this article, keep in mind that these news articles are very skewed in the direction of, or should I say, in favor of the government's involvement. And I would argue that he wasn't your traditional cult leader. He wasn't a cult leader at all, actually, but he was a leader of a cult-like religious group, you can say. And he didn't start this group, the Branch Davidians. He actually assumed leadership after the original leader died, and then the wife took over, and then there's a bunch of stuff with that, but they'll get into that. Now, in 1990, David Koresh became the leader of the Branch Davidians. He and his followers built an army of God by stockpiling weapons in preparation for the apocalypse. On February 28, 1993, the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms raided the Davidians' compound outside of Waco, Texas, resulting in a 51-day siege that drew national attention. The standoff ended when the compound erupted in flames on April 19th. Koresh, who shot himself, was among the dozens found dead. So early years, Koresh was born Vernon Wayne Howe to an unwed teenage mother named Bonnie Clark on August 17, 1959 in Houston, Texas. Spending much of his early years with his grandparents, Koresh attended the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In his senior year, Koresh dropped out of Garland High School to take a carpentry job. While in his early 20s, he spent a short time in Los Angeles trying to make it as a rock star. He rejoined the Seventh-day Adventists after returning to Texas, but was kicked out after butting heads with church leaders. Branch Davidians. In the early 1980s, Koresh, then known as Vernon Howe, moved to Waco, Texas, and joined the Branch Davidians. He had an affair with the sect's much older prophetess, Lois Rodden, and in 1984, he married a teenage Branch Davidian named Rachel Jones, with whom he would have 3 children. When Rodden passed away, Koresh and Rodden's son, George, argued about who would take over the Branch Davidians. Koresh left the sect with his followers and lived in eastern Texas for a while. In 1987, he had a handful of devotees return to Mount Carmel, heavily armed, and shot Rodden, who survived the attack. Koresh and his crew were tried for attempted murder, but were acquitted. In 1990, he legally changed his name from Howe to Koresh after the Persian king and became the Branch Davidians' leader. Koresh's teachings included the practice of spiritual wedding, which enabled him to beg God-chosen female followers of all ages. Koresh fathered at least 12 children with members other than his legal wife. So it says Branch Davidian founder David Koresh during his first visit to Australia to recruit members. He was accompanied by Clive Doyle. Waco siege and death. As leader of the Branch Davidians, Koresh claimed he had cracked the code of the 7 seals in the Book of Revelation, which predicted events leading to the apocalypse. He told his followers that the Lord willed the Davidians to build an army of God. As a result, they started stockpiling weapons. On February 28, 1993, the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms raided the Davidians' Mount Carmel compound near Waco, Texas. A 4-hour gunfight left 6 of Koresh's followers and 4 BATF agents dead, leading to a 51-day standoff between Koresh and federal agents. On April 19, 1993, the Federal Bureau of Investigation launched a tank and tear gas assault on Mount Carmel. Hours later, fires spread throughout the compound, killing more than 6 dozen inhabitants. Koresh was among those found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. All right, now with that being said, let's get into his chart. So here's an image of David Koresh. As you can see, he looked rather dirty and disheveled, and there's a reason for that, and I'll get to that in a minute. So I would say that David Koresh was a narcissist and somewhat of a sociopath, but not to the fullest extent. I think this man was largely misunderstood. I think he was basically just caught up in his delusional religious beliefs, I'll say. But the picture that they paint of him, I believe, is much more problematic than what he actually was. But you could say some of his tactics were sociopathic and narcissistic. So again, date of birth, August 17th, 1959. With that birth number of 17, that's ambition, success, personal acclaim, also becoming immortalized, which he has. Karmic-induced circumstances come with that 17 because it breaks down to 8. Also, this deals with fatherhood, also meanness, and being a punisher. They said that he was kind of rigid with the discipline of children. And there were reports of abuse of children. But they said that CPS went and checked on the children, and those claims of abuse were unfounded. Now, whether that's true or not, that's up for debate. Now, his life path number was 4. 4 pertains to groups, movements, also being on the fringes of society, rebellion. It can also manifest as a communal type of life, also entitlement, also where he could be a dictator or tyrant, connections that he had, also destruction, experiments, a strange or unconventional life, and perversions. So here's an image of the compound Mount Carmel. And here's his chart again. And here he is again making some weird face. I mean, he was a strange dude. One person I read in the comments that said they knew him like just casually, said he was a freak. And that he brought embarrassment upon his mother, that his mother didn't deserve the humiliation. So his ascendant, 1 degree Libra, 1st degree of Libra. With that, that's him leading others. Also seeks out people to will power over. Also, this is his relationship with the child, the underage girl. When she was 14, he married. Ego gets in the way of his ability to form healthy relationships. The North Node conjunct ascendant. So this is him being seen as the opposition, not just with the government, but with the son of the leader of the Branch Davidians, and the other member that tried to be leader, the guy with the cross eyes, which you'll see in a minute. Strategic warfare, sharpshooters, uses people to build him up. Also, the musical talent comes into play with this conjunction. Saturn squaring the ascendant and the North Node. This is him lacking a relationship with his father. He never knew his father. But also government involvement and intervention. Inability to be in balanced relationships due to control issues. Having a poor self-image. Looking unattractive, dowdy. Saturn can produce that type of look. So his ascendant in North Node squaring the Cancer midheaven. This is pointing to the negative publicity that he was receiving. Private life is on display, also infiltration, lack of sound decision-making due to an insular life. Could be representative of Janet Reno's involvement since she's a Cancer. And Janet Reno, she was the Attorney General at the time. I think that's what I think that was her title. Let me just look that up real quick. Janet Reno. A lot of people came for Janet Reno's neck because she authorized the use of the tear gas, as you'll see in one of the video clips I have. All right, I'm searching, and for some reason, okay, it's coming up. Yeah, she was the Attorney General from 1993 to 2001. So this was her first year as Attorney General when she basically called for the use of the CG gas, I think it's called. Uranus semi-square ascendant. Breaking up relationships. Unstable and unconventional relationships. The perversion of relationships. So he basically told his male members to practice celibacy, and he basically helped himself to their wives. Taking on the previous group leader's name, creating a faction group, unstable personality, looking unkempt. So there's a T-square involving his Saturn ascendant and the nodes. And with this deals with the struggles that he was dealing with the previous leader's son, and also the situation he got into with the government as well. So here's a quote. It says, before long, their power struggle began to consume the church, and the Branch Davidians were forced to take sides. When Rodin, who's the leader's son, got the upper hand, he forced Koresh and his most devoted followers off Mount Carmel property at gunpoint. He met a similarly heavily armed Rodin, and a fight broke out. Shots were fired, and Rodin was injured, though not fatally. The skirmish would go down in history as a missed warning sign and a precursor to the Waco siege. So here he is. I think that's Rachel, his wife, where he married her when she was 14. Now, keep in mind that that was a legal marriage, because in Texas at the time, you could get married, you could consent to marriage at 14. So his ascendant was conjoined to Astrological, which is an asteroid that deals with health. So that could deal with health problems. He might have had a kidney problem because of that Libra energy. His ascendant running parallel to Juno, with Juno being at the 21st degree of Libra. That's him having multiple wives. And he may feel like he's nothing without women. Also, it's quoted that he encouraged marriages between men and multiple women, but he was the one benefiting from this because, again, at some point, he told the men that they need to be celibate and that he was supposed to impregnate a bunch of different women to spread his seed. So that's very narcissistic and sociopathic. His ascendant conjoined to Persephone. So that can deal with him imprisoning women. Now, these women were staying of their own free will, but you can still imprison someone's mind. Also, the hostage situation that was taking place during the standoff with the ATF and the FBI, and him taking a teenage girl as a bride. So it's quoted as saying, as well as marriages to underage girls and engaged in sexual relationships with not only his wife, but his wife's 13-year-old sister. Ascendant parallel, the asteroid Cassandra. Cassandra deals with advice given and oftentimes advice that is not followed. So this can deal with Koresh being ill-advised or misled, ignoring wise counsel, believing he is receiving messages from God brought on by either drug-induced delusions or maybe some schizophrenic type of disorder. Also, misleading others. So again, here's his chart right here. That Aries South Node means that he's coming from a past life of violence. And he might have been really good with the use of firearms in a past life, being a sharpshooter, even with that South Node in Aries in the 7th house. So his North Node at the 5th degree of Libra in the 5th house, in the 1st house. One thing that stood out was that it was reported that he went to live with his grandmother. Well, his grandmother started caring for him when his mother was unable to, when he was about 18 months old. So from 18 months to 5 years old, he was living with his grandmother. At 5 years old, his mother ended up taking him and she raised him thereafter, but then he went back to his grandmother's for a period of time. But that 5th degree can deal with 5 years old. Some significant changes were happening, namely his mother taking him back. So teaching others, having power over people's minds, but especially women. Taking on someone else's identity and name, creating enemies as a result. That's just the North Node in that 1st house in Libra. Mercury was forming a sextile with his North Node. This is him being a charismatic teacher and preacher with Mercury ruling that 9th house via Gemini. Also him wowing others with his ability to quote the Bible verbatim. So it's quoted as saying, he believed it was up to him to bring the word of God to his followers. The moon was forming a trine with his North Node, attracting a large following. Him having magnetic attraction with his moon being in Aquarius. Also, this is the strategic takeover of the compound. Also, him being at liberty to marry multiple women. Unconventional marriages and relationships of convenience. Also, it was quoted that though Lois, who was the church leader once her husband had died, who was the original church leader, was 65 at the time of Koresh arrival, many Davidians believed that the new widow entered into a sexual relationship with Koresh, which gave him the power to move up quickly through the ranks of the church. So that's dealing with that moon trine North Node as well. And that moon's in the 5th house. There it is, trine North Node. So his North Node was conjoined to Orpheus, which is an asteroid that pertains to death and mourning, but it also pertains to music. And he played the guitar, and he wanted to be a rock star at one point. His North Node opposing the Arabic part of servants, challenges with keeping his servants in line at times. Also, some of his servants turned against him. So we're going to move over to the 7th house. So his 7th house cusp is at the 1st degree of Aries. That is Koresh seeking to be an authority over others, abuse of children, at war with a man, that son of the original leader, but also the other guy that tried to be a leader as well, trading gunfire, competing for the top post. His Mars ruling that 7th house, 17 degrees Virgo in the 12th. And 17 was a significant age for him as well. Obedient partners slash spouses, that's what he's wanting. Young partners slash spouses, taking virginities, expecting a devoted helpmate. Mars conjunct Venus. In relation to the 7th house, this is him subjecting his partners and his mates to a dress code, wanting them to look very plain. His demand for submissive wives. Relationships are one-sided, with David being the only one who matters. This can also deal with him taking other men's wives as well. Mars semi-square Neptune, looking disheveled, unkempt, stealing an identity, which he was accused of when he changed his name to David Koresh, self-delusions, infiltration of an informant, doesn't trust anyone, troubles with sleeping, rarely sleeps, shooting self in the foot in terms of his refusal to surrender. Mars is conjoined to Asterion, which is a fixed star that could result in being slovenly, which he did kind of look slovenly, Very immoral, shameless. Also, it could deal with being revolting, but also a revolt, and also being mean, and sorrows in love. That South Node at the 5th degree of Aries in his 7th house, that's him changing his name to David Koresh. Mercury and Leo trine Aries South Node, becoming or being appointed the leader of the branch Davidians. Changing his name to David Koresh, that's just reinforcing that, and basically just becoming the leader. Great command over his followers, taking other men's wives for himself, ready, willing, and able to protect his flock, Mercury ruling that 9th house. And this quote, what he did have was camouflage, an invasion map, and a lot of weapons. So he could have been in the army in a past life. Again, he could have been a sharpshooter with that Aries South Node in the 7th house. And military strategy is very much about that Aries South Node in the 7th house as well. The weapons, all that. Saturn squaring the South Node. This is him being abused by his father figure because his real father wasn't in his life, but his mother remarried, or no, she didn't even marry the first guy because she was too young. But she married this abusive guy, so that's him getting abused. Being affected by real father not being in his life, father creating another family. A hardened ego that is prone to sadistic actions. Will cut off his own nose despite his fates. Takes on another person's identity in order to overcompensate for feelings of inadequacy. A fight to become president, head of the branch Davidians. Shootout with the police/military.
Most people who condemn the Branch Davidians and justify the horrific siege do so by pointing to the allegations of illegal firearms, child abuse involving sex with young girls, their doomsday philosophy, and the alleged ambush by the sect on the first day of the siege, all of which we're about to get into. But before we do, it's important to know that not a single one of these was a new element for the Davidians. And while you may disagree with the morality, the lifestyle, or the politics of the residents in Mount Carmel in 1993, we have to consider why nearly 80 people, including over 20 children, had to die for the alleged crimes of a single man. The man that brought the apocalyptic might of the US government to New Mount Carmel was of course Vernon Howe, who, now in control of the Branch Davidians, started to morph into David Koresh. I would never accuse Vernon of being a role model before he took power by any means, but after, he truly became a different man. Anyone as desperate for power as he was will surely abuse it, and his progression is pretty clear. Vernon was named the successor of the church in 1983, and by 1984, he had married a 14-year-old Branch Davidian named Rachel Jones. Sadly, there was no problems with this legally, as the age of consent in Texas was 14 until the 2000s. And although this was the beginning of his transformation into Koresh, it was not official until he legally changed his name for publicity and business purposes in 1990. And henceforth I will use the name David Koresh to refer to the leader formerly known as Vernon. He landed on the name David as a reference to King David from the Bible, the second king of ancient Israel, and he picked Koresh to pay homage to Cyrus the Great, a Persian ruler who helped lead the Jews from persecution. And while we know that Koresh was most likely a power-hungry pervert, he did make several improvements to the Mount Carmel property when he returned. In his absence, George Rodin began renting out one of the cottages to somebody who was using it as a meth lab. David Koresh, upon its discovery, called the cops and had them safely remove it. Next, he had everybody who lived there painstakingly disassemble their homes and the rest of the recreational and administrative structures so that they could pool the building materials and create one giant compound. And though the plan sounds stupid and impossible, David was able to motivate and coordinate the population there to create a home that they were all proud of. Sure, it's an architectural abomination, but the economy and utility of the construction was phenomenal. At the time of its construction, it housed over 100 people with room to grow. The multi-story compound offered the community several amenities. There was an auditorium with a stage, a gymnasium, a large outdoor swimming pool, a cafeteria with a large kitchen and food storage area, and a computer room. There was a large 4-story watchtower with a reinforced bunker below it, as well as a trap door into another part of the building, which led to a buried school bus that served as a fallout shelter. Outside the compound stood a large water tower and several fuel tanks, practically everything the group would need in an emergency, which you have to admit are odd choices for a group that the FBI and ATF said were always planning to die. And over the next couple of years, the church grew to some 130 members before the tragic conclusion, and it was during this time that David Koresh would start acting in a way that could draw attention, even on a secluded compound. I believe much of his preaching was used as a way to manipulate his followers in order to gratify his own sexual desires. He started by announcing that he could have multiple wives, a term I will use loosely here because Koresh only ever married his first wife. He also had every man take an oath of celibacy for the sole purpose of mass cucking, and the women that he chose to sleep with were often the wives of other members, or even their daughters. He was able to accomplish this by proclaiming that he needed to have children by 24 different women in order to seed the world with new disciples, or generals, for the returned Jesus after the apocalypse. And somehow, this went over fine with everybody in the group. Well, everybody but one man who just wanted to be seeding the women himself, but we will get to that in a little bit. In the short handful of years that Koresh led the Branch Davidians, he managed to father 12 children from 8 members, some of them very young, though he was careful to abide by Texas's age of consent. The group not only accepted the oddity, but everybody was happy to be a part of this strange community and did their best to support it. Those who had jobs outside of the compound tithed 10 to 20% of their income. The Branch Davidians also ran several small businesses themselves. This included a seamstress, a small auto body shop, and a firearms dealing hustle reselling guns at local gun shows, all which were well above board.
So David Koresh had a yacht in his chart involving his Aries South Node forming a quincunx with Neptune and Pluto, with Neptune forming a sextile with Pluto. So yachts are also known as the finger of fate or the finger of God, and it does deal with fated circumstances that start off well but end very badly, and people can get hurt in the process. People can get killed in the process when it comes to some yachts, especially when malefics are involved like Neptune and Pluto. And then with that South Node, we're dealing with karmic induced circumstances. So some of what occurred with this yacht is representative of the love triangles, especially in terms of him taking other men's wives, but it can also deal with where he started sleeping with his wife's sister, because yachts often produce love triangles that end up being messy. Also, him getting into a shootout with the leader's son, Rodden. Also, a shootout with the ATF after the disgruntled member ratted him out. And the tear gas or whatever type of gas concoction that was used by the ATF to try to smoke out the Branch Davidians. And that ended up starting a fire. Now, his South Node was conjoined to the Arabic part of servants, and that could deal with a past life of being an eager servant of war, Call of Duty type of past life, you can say. Maybe he was a Green Beret or something in World War II or something like that. So let's get into the second house. So second house cusp, 29 degrees Libra. 29th degree can produce high pressure situations. When it's the 29th degree of Libra, high pressure situations involving other people or involving the enemy. Conflicts in relationships, especially over money, values, standards, and policies. Expecting a partner to fully conform to your standards. Scorpio intercepted in his second house. Values based upon strong convictions, but also sexual values, being sexually possessive. And that can also deal with some demonic possession as well, perhaps. Especially because he got Jupiter and Neptune in that second house. Demonic possession, demonic attachment. Venus, Mars, and Pluto are rulers of that second house, and they're all in Virgo. So the strong Virgo influence causes him to be neurotic, hypercritical, nitpicky, fault-finding, anxious, and insecure. Also, this Virgo energy upon the second house is representing the dietary and grooming standards, his dress code policy, and wanting blind obedience from his followers. Also, he earned money through gun sales, a seamstress shop, and a car repair shop, which is all Virgo-related businesses. Except for the gun sales. The gun sales come in with just Venus conjunct Mars. Sorry, just to clarify that. The seamstress, that's the Virgo energy. The car repair shop, that's the Virgo energy. Again, here's that Scorpio intercepted in the second house. Mars and Venus both ruling that second house in the 12th house. And then Pluto, co-ruler of that second house in Virgo as well in the 11th. So Neptune, 4 degrees Scorpio in the second house. This is him being a member of a cult-like group based on doomsday end time scenario. Mercury is squaring his Neptune. That can make him delusional, dishonest, self-deception. He could have like a schizotypal personality, mind control perhaps, addiction, irrational or illogical decision-making. Mars semi-square Neptune, self-delusions, addictive personality, paranoid personality, lacking sexual discretions and boundaries, being plagued by demons, getting caught up in a cult, being duped, brainwashing. So again, he didn't start the Branch Davidians, he joined them and then later became a leader. So he was basically being susceptible to the indoctrination of this cult-like group and the brainwashing and all that, believing about these end times. And this Branch Davidians, the original leader, he basically predicted the end of the world or Armageddon. And then I think he predicted in 1955 and then it didn't come true. And now he got egg on his face. So these fringe religious groups, they tend to be very focused on Armageddon and the end times. And that alone is very cult-like, where they're just preparing for the end and they just devote their life to the leader because he's going to show them the way out or the way to salvation or what have you. Here he is right here looking kind of geeky and doofy. Kind of giving me that Bill Gates kind of vibe. So Neptune sextile Pluto. This is a cross-generational aspect. So you really got to take the house placements into account. So his Neptune in the second with Pluto in the 11th. This is devoted servants who are willing to sacrifice their lives for him. Neptune quincunx South Node. Again, this is part of that Yod aspect pattern. Twisted values based upon strong convictions. Twisted sexual values. Being sexually possessive. Neptune is in trine with his midheaven. This is David Koresh being viewed as a savior, having his way with women. Also government secrets, covert operative, and the ATF did send, it was either the ATF or the FBI, they sent an undercover agent in there and he was perpetrating like he wanted to be part of the Branch Davidians. So I included this quote just to show you the stuff that, the weird conflict he was involved in with the leader's son who wanted to be leader. Said, but Koresh had other plans. While Rahbinah was exhuming and praying over the corpse of a woman who had been in the ground for 20 years, David Koresh was chatting with Waco authorities who he felt would be interested to learn about Rahbinah's illegal exhumation. And that's how Rahbinah was basically, that was the beginning of his downfall. So basically the backstory is when Koresh started saying he was a prophet of God and saying that he was destined to become leader of the Branch Davidians, Rahbinah challenged him and said, well, if you're a prophet of God, then you should be able to raise the dead. So Rahbinah actually exhumed the dead body of a woman, and Koresh didn't want no parts of that. He was like, and this shows you that Koresh wasn't all that crazy. Koresh was like, nah, I don't want to do that. And Rahbinah instead was trying to bring this woman back from the dead to prove that he was the chosen one. And Koresh went to the authorities and snitched on him. And then later on, it only ended the following year when Rodden was charged with murder after he killed his roommate. So again, this is dealing with that Yod. Wayman Adair with an axe. He believed the man was an assassin in the pay of David Koresh. Rodden was actually found not guilty, but only because the jury ruled him insane and sent him to a mental hospital. So that Yod and David Koresh chart is dealing with his entanglement with this Rodden character. His Jupiter, 23 degrees Scorpio in the second house. Being highly favored, that's what that 23rd degree can produce. And with Jupiter being highly favored in terms of religion, spirituality, being highly favored as a religious figure, well-traveled and well-read. One of the clips is showing that he spent time in Australia trying to recruit members. Powerful speech is what that 23rd degree can produce, 23rd degree of Scorpio. Strong religious convictions that can be scary, extreme. Jupiter and Scorpio will produce that period. Being obsessed with learning the Bible, with Jupiter ruling that third house. Got with dead leader's wife when he was 23 years old. Now, some reports are saying that it was 77 at the time, but other reports are saying she was 65, or unless she was 65 when he joined the Branch Davidians, and then maybe once she was 77, he started smashing her in order to become leader. Sun and Uranus square Jupiter. This can make him a sexual deviant. Also, him being an all or nothing kind of person, where he has the tendency to go overboard, and that can include with his religious beliefs, going all out, allowing power to consume and corrupt him, perversion of biblical teachings to suit his own ego-fueled desires. Jupiter square Chiron. Heavy karmic debt, fated and destined events that are shocking and unsettling, a hard knock life, you can say. Jupiter is running contraparallel to the asteroid Atlantis, and this can produce a feeling of impending doom. And that's definitely what he was going through with the ATF all breathing down his neck, preaching death and doom, but also that whole preaching death and doom, doomsday, Armageddon, hell and brimstone kind of preacher, believing he is being punished for past life misdeeds, taking a god or superiority complex too far. Jupiter conjoined to the fixed star Agena. Now this can manifest as good health, and they were responsible for their own health care. So they had he was like a natural path that they would go to. They went to had their own doctor and stuff like that. Disillusion through love, high morals, success with the masses. Now with the high morals, he might have thought his morals were high, but they were twisted nonetheless. Jupiter running parallel to the fixed star Boss. That can produce keen intellect. It's good for business, military, analysis. Jupiter running parallel to Merzam. This is a fixed star that produces good qualities, can make one charitable. And I think he was charitable, faithful, but also it can produce dangerous passions. And it's known as the roarer and the announcer. So this star can be related to reporters, journalists, public speakers. So this in particular deals with the reading, the statement to be broadcast, the Seven Seals manuscript. And also he made some other media appearances where he was trying to clear his name. Also, the voice from the loudspeaker during the standoff can be represented by this aspect. So we got to look at the 8th house now because it's directly opposing the 2nd. So he had the 29th degree of Aries on the 8th house cuts, and this can produce high pressure situations involving firearms and fire, deadly fire, bombs that cause fire, or in that case, the tear gas that ignited some flammables, transforming his identity into David Koresh. Taurus intercepted in the 8th house. This is him stockpiling food and supplies for crisis/end times. Also, joint finances. So he received funding from his members through tithes and offering, and I'm thinking he probably received some outside funding as well, maybe through the government, food stamps and stuff. No, I don't think he was dependent on the government like that, but it does make me question that Taurus intercepting the 8th house, where else he was getting money from. Obsessed with security, putting the safety of others in jeopardy, having a corrupt value system. Also, this is dealing with the Tibetan chants and other sounds being played by the ATF as a psychological torture device. And they kept playing this one song over and over. These boots are made for walking by Nancy Sinatra. And I was listening to that song today, and I was wondering why they chose that song in particular. But the beginning, the first part of the song, the melody is real like it's hard. I'm not well versed in music theory, but the beginning part, the tone is very low. So I could see how that could contribute to psychological torture if you have to hear it over and over again. It's very low and it's kind of disorienting. Mars conjunct Venus in Virgo, using other people's money to execute his vision, with Mars and Venus in the 12th house, being accused by some of the original members of stealing the old leader's identity, reselling firearms. 3rd house. So this is interesting. He has the 0 degree of Sagittarius on the 3rd house cusp, which is pure Sagittarius energy, impacting his mind and his communication style. Now, this also deals with the special education classes that he was put in, because Sagittarius, when combined with the 3rd house, can deal with special education, whether it's, because you have some type of learning disability, or special education could even mean gifted and talented. In his case, he had a learning disability. He had dyslexia. Also, the 0 degree of Sagittarius on the 3rd house cusp points to the Bible study. Also, him speaking with a high and mighty tone. Jupiter, ruler of that 3rd house, being in Scorpio. Sex always on his mind, perhaps. Also, he was said to have spoken a crude and vulgar manner at times. He could be very controlling and manipulative in terms of his mindset. And keep in mind that he could speak the Bible verbatim. So that 0 degree of Sagittarius on that 3rd house cusp speaks to that. Jupiter square Uranus. So he dropped out of high school at the age of 17. And Uranus is at the 17th degree of Leo. And then he has another planet at the 17th degree as well. I'm trying to remember what it was. His dyslexia. So he had dyslexia, which is a learning disability. And that deals with Jupiter square Uranus, but also his Mercury opposition moon contributed to the dyslexia as well. Saturn at the Aries point of Capricorn in the 3rd house, but is conjoined to the 4th house cusp. So it's very much affecting the 4th house as well. So this could deal with mind control. So again, mind control through the religion, but sometimes I even question, was this all like a government experiment to see, or a government exercise to incite fear in the American population of what could happen if you try to go off on your own and have a stockpile of weapons to defend yourself if being attacked by the government, and if you're an ultra religious right-wing group. And this isn't the first situation where the ATF has attacked an ultra religious right-wing group. There was a story called Ruby Ridge, where there was a massacre of this man's family. I might do a case study on that too. So with Saturn at the 0 degree of Capricorn ruling that being in the 3rd house, that can make him prone to depression. But also just that Saturn in the 3rd house, that's just like the government was always watching him, you could say. And that's one of the reasons why I say target. Also, this can make him overly suspicious, words that punish and degrade others, and he could have a quasi-sadistic mindset. I'm not going to say, the more I learned about David Koresh, the more I'll say he wasn't totally sadistic, but in some ways he kind of was. Also, dropping out of school is very much Saturn and Capricorn in the third house as well. So here's that Saturn. It's technically in the third house, but is very much influencing that fourth house, and for a good reason, with the government involvement, the ATF posted up outside of the compound, and also the struggle for control of that compound with the leader's son and the other guy and all that madness. But that Saturn at the 0 degree of Capricorn, that's the Aries point. When you have that, usually faded external circumstances are going to rock your world in some way. Now, it could be in a good way in some cases, and he does have Pluto trine Saturn. He has Sun trine Saturn, so that really helps him to be in control of the members of the branch Davidians. It made him basically the type of guy that could handle business and could manage a large group of people like that. But moving along. Sun and Pluto trine Saturn. So again, powerful and influential authority figure. Also his rise to the top through the death of the previous leader with the Pluto influence. Saturn sesqui square Uranus. Power being cut off at the compound by the authorities, by the ATF and the FBI once the siege took place. Also, they used floodlights to try to, create this, to disorient them and to just torture them. So they couldn't get sleep, because sleep deprivation is a form of torture. So they use sound and they use floodlights to prevent them from sleeping, which is going to produce some temporary psychosis, even if it's done long enough and intense enough. Saturn square North and South Node, lacking a relationship with his father. The government is viewed as the enemy, at war with the government. Now, his mother, Saturn opposing the midheaven. His mother was just 14 when she had David, and his father disappeared before he was born. So that's just dealing with the father not wanting anything to do with the mother. But also that's the government involvement, especially when they rented a house. So the ATF rented a house directly across from the compound so that they could watch them. And that's very much Saturn opposition midheaven as well. Saturn opposition Nemesis. The government was his nemesis. And Nemesis is an asteroid that deals with where you place blame, or it could deal with your arch enemy. So the government was his nemesis, but also the leader's son and that other guy that I forget his name, but it's in one of the clips. The other guy that tried to take over leadership. Saturn running parallel to Deshuba. Sudden assaults, malevolence, immorality, and shamelessness. Mass catastrophe. But it also produces skill in battle, and it's good for conducting research, especially into secrets and hidden things. More about that in a minute, because he had a couple of guys who were like computer whizzes, and they were able to hack into the ATF's files, computer files or something like that. That supposedly is what really set the ATF off. So it's interesting that this is dealing with that star, and Saturn's running parallel to it. Also being adept, patient, and wary. Saturn conjoined to the fixed star Spiculum. This can produce eye trouble, and he did wear glasses, and they look rather thick. Blindness, depression, being hopelessly doomed, and having a morbid religious outlook upon life, and no concern for human life. Now, because Saturn's involved, the no concern for human life, that's not coming from David Koresh. That's coming from the ATF, the FBI, the government agencies that basically just started shooting up that compound. Again, shooting the tear gas canisters into the compound, creating the fire, shooting some of the people as they were running out. I mean, this was an absolute massacre at the hands of the U.S. government. So, again, David Koresh, I see him as a narcissist, quasi-sociopath, but still, with that being said, him and the branch Davidians did not deserve to be dealt with in the manner that they were, because they really weren't a threat like the ATF and the FBI was saying. Saturn conjoined to the Arabic part of increase. That's the increase in government presence during that standoff that lasted 51 days. So they said over 700 cops, FBI, and ATF agents were outside of that compound. Again, overkill, just ridiculous. So again, I feel like they were sending a message to the American people, don't fuck with us. And fucking with them is basically just being your own group on the fringes of society, being very religious, and having a stockpile of weapons. So we go from the 3rd house to the 9th house. So 0-degree Gemini on that 9th house cusp, that's him learning the Bible verbatim, word for word, and being able to quote any Bible verse. And he was also challenging other religious leaders and stuff, or church leaders, or and making some of them mad, believing he's receiving messages directly from God. I guess I forgot to put God in there. But basically, that's what that's doing. Now, that's because with Gemini, especially the 0-degree of Gemini on the 9th house cusp, that makes one's mind very open to the superconscious realm. So you might think you are hearing the voice of God. And, you know, religious people say this all the time. They'd be like, oh, yeah, God told me to do this. God talked to me last night. I had a talk with Jesus last night. And that's because their 9th house is lit up a lot of times. And they're receiving messages, and it may not be God, it may not be Jesus, but it's like they're tapping into the superconscious mind, also known as the universal mind. And for some, it could drive some people crazy, and they could actually hear voices. Mercury, ruler of the 9th house, at 7 degrees Leo in the 11th. This is David Koresh receiving praise and adoration for his ability to quote the Bible verbatim. Also, him being a leader of a religious cult-like group. Religion is used to glorify himself, not really God and Jesus, but to glorify himself. And that's where that narcissism is coming into play as well. So Moon in Aquarius opposing Mercury and Uranus. So again, we're dealing with the 9th house. Mercury rules the 9th house. It's conjoined to Uranus and opposing that Moon in Aquarius. So with this is him being separated from his mother due to her boyfriend/husband. And this quote right here speaks of this opposition. It says his mother's new boyfriend was prone to violent outbursts and had a drinking problem, meaning David spent long stretches of time with his grandmother. Also, him being ostracized, alienated, a splintering off, creating a faction, revolt, rebellion. Receiving signals, transmissions, downloads of information with Mercury ruling that 9th house through Gemini. Hearing discarded voices, again, Mercury ruling the 9th and the 12th houses. When you got Mercury ruling the 9th and the 12th, yeah, your mind could be prone to delusions of religious themes, spiritual themes, believing you are the Messiah or the prophet or the chosen one. Now, to David Koresh's defense, he never claimed that he was Jesus, but he did claim that he was a prophet, and he did basically believe that he was the chosen one to bring the Branch Davidians into divinity, maybe, or to bring them to salvation. Also, this is intrusive thoughts that are coming in. Moon in Aquarius quincunx Venus in the 12th. So this quote right here speaks of this aspect. He fell in love with his pastor's daughter and used a Bible verse to claim to her father that God wanted the girl to be his mate. Unsurprisingly, the pastor expelled him from the congregation. Now, that's a combination of this quincunx, but also Moon opposition Mercury. Relations grew steadily worse. Koresh claimed that God had ordained that he should have a child with Lois, an idea that outraged and revolted George Rodden. So again, George Rodden was the son of Lois, who was the leader of the Branch Davidians at the time. Koresh started to have a relationship with her, even though he was only 23 and she was around 70 in her 70s at the time. Mercury square Neptune. Again, with Mercury ruling that 9th house. He was also growing more emphatic, the quote says, preaching a bizarre and dramatic gospel. On one memorable visit to Israel, he had a vision that convinced him He was the modern day incarnation of the prophet Cyrus, which is why he chose the name Koresh. But that wasn't his most unusual conviction. Exile from the Branch Davidians had driven Koresh deeper into his delusions, and he began to claim that God had granted him strange powers. His fate, he was certain, would be martyrdom. Well, he was right about that. He became convinced through conversations with God that Mount Carmel was the earthbound site of the Davidic kingdom and that he must return. Fourth house. So, fourth house is very important in this case because that compound came under attack. So it makes a lot of sense that Capricorn's on the fourth house cusp with the government agencies seizing or the siege upon the compound with the government agency. This story is very like complicated and complex. That's why I'm like tripping over my words, but y'all gonna have to forgive me. So first degree of Capricorn, fourth house cusp, competing for control over Mount Carmel compound, being appointed. And again, he was basically being appointed by Lois Rodden, who was the wife of the leader that died. Wielding total authority over compound, a military installation. So remember I said a military installation consisted of that house that the ATF was renting across the street. And Saturn, ruler of that fourth house, is opposing the midheaven, which speaks to that. Saturn and Capricorn in the third house, communications from police, FBI, military, ATF agents. Spent many days cooped up, learning the Bible, New and Old Testaments. Saturn opposition midheaven, again, ATF rented a house directly across from the compound for surveillance. And then here's this quote. Then on February 28th, 1993, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms raided the compound.
Paul Fata, a Branch Davidian, had acquired a federal license to buy and sell guns and created the retail business called the Mag Bag, which was about 2 miles from Mount Carmel. He, Mike Schroeder, and David Koresh would buy and sell from local vendors frequently. The Mag Bag did well for itself, and it was well known by the local law enforcement, who had made several trips to check that things were copacetic after a few complaints were lodged about the gunfire heard from the property. And despite his best efforts to keep things legal, a scorned Branch Davidian would ensure that they'd find trouble. Enter Mark Bro, aspiring group leader, seeder, and salt lord extraordinaire. The history of the Davidians had had no shortage of power struggles, and Bro thought he was ready to take on Koresh. His efforts were unsupported and transparent, however, and he was kicked from Mount Carmel for immoral behavior. And in response to being exiled, he vowed to get revenge. He began calling in child abuse and illegal firearms allegations to the local authorities. He also made reports to the Cult Awareness Network to disparage the group that he was just previously campaigning to lead. Child Protective Services made several trips out to the property to investigate the child abuse charges, but after coming up with nothing incriminating whatsoever, the case was officially dropped on April 30th, 1992. And with this thirst for vengeance left unquenched, Mark Bro began going to the press. And at the same time the CPS was investigating, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms opened up their own case against Koresh and began asking about him at the local gun shops. The ATF wasn't going to be so easy to shake, as they were still licking their wounds from all the bad press following their botched siege at Ruby Ridge just 6 months earlier. With their public perception at an all-time low, they were looking to pick up a quick, easy win to turn that around. They began by collecting information about the group around town, questioning the gun shops that they did business with. Unfortunately, none of them had anything bad to say about Koresh or his followers. One of these shops even reached out to Koresh to tell him that the ATF had been asking questions, to which Koresh said, "We have nothing to hide," and invited them out to come look at their inventory and paperwork, something that the ATF never took them up on. Instead, they decided to rent out a vacant house that was close to the property, a small 2-bedroom place, which they moved 4 agents into with nothing but cases of surveillance gear. This brilliant plan was almost entirely transparent to the Branch Davidians, several of who saw the ATF move their men and their gear into the undersized home. Wanting to see if their suspicions had any merit, a few of them went by with food to welcome them to the area and invite them to a service at Mount Carmel. The man who answered made sure to only crack the door and ended the interaction as quickly as he could. an indication that the Branch Davidians' fears were warranted. Still, Koresh and his followers did their best to play it cool and find other methods to get their innocence across to the ATF in more creative ways.
You have guns? Yeah, we have some. Well, can we see that? Is that okay? Well, I guess if you want. You know what the public thinks about guns. You know in this country right now, legislation is to ban all guns, right? And it makes nobody's business whether we have a gun or not at this place. Guns are the right of Americans to have. Our government's the greatest in the world. We have freedom, not freedom for religion, not freedom for state, but freedom for all, you see? And that's what a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people say, he's got guns, that makes him bad, that makes him a cult, you know? It's just a raw deal in this touchy subject we're dealing with. They come in here with a gun and they start shooting at us, what would you do? Tell me, be realistic. This is America, this is not Australia, this is not Europe. This is not where a country overthrows a bunch of people, takes away their weapons so that the people cannot argue any issues.
It was not very effective, but it wasn't long until his next opportunity came strolling up onto the property at Mount Carmel. The undercover ATF agent, pretending to be a college student interested in God and guns, requested to meet Koresh, and David was happy to oblige. Of course, he had a suspicion that he was law enforcement, but he thought it was a good attempt to collect evidence that was not there, a chance that he welcomed. The infiltrator was junior ATF agent Robert Rodriguez, and he would continue to return to the property for prayer sessions and opportunities to shoot with Koresh. All this time, Koresh was jogging every day along the same route that passed right in front of the ATF surveillance house. If they wanted to take him, they knew they could have just pulled up a police car and arrested him. He also made trips into town regularly, so the opportunities to take Koresh in a mundane fashion using a single patrol car were always there. But they were never what the ATF wanted. Instead, in 1993, the ATF went to a judge looking for a warrant to go into the compound by force. And I emphasize, force. 2/3 of the complaints made in the search warrant, all of which came from Mark Bro, were child abuse allegations that he claimed to have seen 5 years previously, far surpassed the 6-month limit on information that could be used to obtain a search warrant. And I'll remind you that it's not the ATF's responsibility to go after child abuse charges, it's not their jurisdiction. That falls under the Child Protective Services, who had already done their due diligence to dismiss the same accusations. The remainder of their request was made up of gun charges or drug allegations that were already dealt with or completely fabricated. The ATF claimed that they had AK-47s with modified lowers, a gun without a lower to modify. They also asserted that there was boys' anti-tank guns, also known as elephant guns, on the property. And while this is illegal, their evidence was footage from the Australian interview that showed legal .50 caliber rifles. Finally, they cited the meth lab that David himself had reported when he moved back onto the property at Mount Carmel, something that would have been easy to confirm by checking with local law enforcement, but instead, it was used as a way to get helicopters for the heroic face-saving raid, something that was only authorized with the cooperation of the DEA. The presentation of all this bullshit information resulted in the judge's approval of a knock search warrant, which usually involves a knock. Knowing this, the ATF planned to ask for forgiveness later and started preparing their swift, dynamic entry plan. While there were many missteps in the carrying out of this plan, the biggest came from choosing to alert the press of the morning raid, something done to highlight their public show of force. Unfortunately, they did not give a time for the raid, just the date, and this led to some plucky young journalist driving around the back roads of Waco hoping to find the Branch Davidian compound before finally flagging down a mailman to ask for directions. The mailman, a man named David Jones, and the brother-in-law of David Koresh, kindly explained where he could find the compound before asking why he was heading there, and when the reporter told them that he'd gotten a tip from law enforcement, David Jones headed straight home to inform the 130 people living inside a full 45 minutes before the ATF would arrive. The people at the compound were already on alert, as news of the Waco Tribune article had made its way there. One member even went out and got a bunch of copies so that people could read it. Robert Rodriguez, the undercover ATF agent, was already in the compound when David Jones arrived to tell Koresh what he had heard. He was actually having a conversation with David Koresh at the time, one that Robert Rodriguez describes as perfectly normal. But after he got the news, he was frantic, panicked. He looked at his ATF friend and said, "Robert, they're coming for me. I know it." Instead of calling it off or changing the plan, the ATF told their men to write their blood type on their arm or neck before they left the staging area that morning. They loaded up, and around 8 o'clock on February 28, 1993, the two cattle trailers bumped and rattled down the path towards the compound. Previous intelligence had led them to believe that most of the men would be outside working on a storm shelter that was under construction. But this wasn't the case when they pulled up, so they had to improvise. One team moved to neutralize the Branch Davidians' dogs. They had an 80-pound Malamute named Fawn. Her and her 4 puppies were outside in a pen. The 3 helicopters were also approaching from the rear of the compound. At this moment, David Koresh exited the front door of the compound, unarmed, waving his hands, telling them to stop. There were women and children. But immediately gunfire started. Many question where it came from. Some say the helicopters. Some say an ATF agent shooting himself in the leg as he's going up the ladder. And the ATF would all say that the Branch Davidians fired first. But as revealed in the Waco investigation of 1995, the first shots taken were likely at the dogs, but bullets began ripping through the front door as David retreated inside. The scene was immediate chaos. A hellish rain of gunfire started pouring in from above as the helicopters took aim at David Koresh's room. In fear for their own lives and their families' lives, Branch Davidians began firing back on the ATF.
After I got upstairs, I heard 3 helicopters. The reason I know they were 3 because I looked out the window to see where they were, what they were doing, and they were firing on us. I saw it and I heard it. And I was in the back of the building. That's where my room was. And they were firing toward David's room. And they turned, and when they turned, I fell to the floor because I could see that those bullets could have hit me if I was standing. So they went to the front of the building, and it seemed like when they got in the front, by the time they got to the front, they were firing again, and so all the others were firing.
Retreated off the roof, ATF agents began shooting wildly into the house, indiscriminate of the innocent lives within. To the ATF, they were all guilty. Ironically, many of the guns that the ATF was there to find were with Paul Fata at a gun show in Austin, something that the ATF surveillance would have surely known. 3 more Branch Davidians were at the mag bag a few miles away when the raid started. Mike Schroeder, one of the men, jumped the fence and tried to make it in. Unarmed, he was shot in the back 7 times as an agent emptied 30 rounds in his direction. The ATF chose to leave his body rotting there in the Texas sun for several days, and they only decided to retrieve it with a grappling hook once wild dogs were found feasting on his body. The initial gun battle lasted 2 hours, and a ceasefire was only called once the ATF ran out of ammo. The Davidians were only firing defensively and were begging for a ceasefire the entire time over several 911 calls.
911, what's your emergency? 911, what's your emergency?
There are men, 75 men around our building.
Okay, just a moment.
This Lynch. Hello? Hello?
75 men.
Hello? 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 Yeah, this is Lieutenant Lynch. May I help you? Yeah, there are 75 men around our building and they're shooting at us in Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel? Yeah, tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off. All right, hello?
Yeah, this is Lynch.
Hey, Lynch?
Yeah.
That's kind of a funny name there. Oh, listen, no,
Now, who am I speaking with?
This is David Koresh.
Okay, David.
The Notorious. What did you guys do that for?
Well, what I'm doing is I'm trying to establish some communication links with you.
No, let me tell you something.
Yes, sir.
You see, you brought a bunch of guys out here and you killed some of my children. We told you we wanted to talk. No, how come you guys try to be ATF agents? How come you try to be so big all the time?
Okay, David.
There's a bunch of us dead, there's a bunch of you guys dead. Now that's your fault.
4 ATF agents had died and more than 20 were injured. 6 Branch Davidians also lay dead, but that number would not stop rising until the ordeal was over 51 days later.
So David Koresh's midheaven was at the 1st degree of cancer, and that deals with his mother's boyfriend and husband. So she had a series of boyfriends who were like abusive, and then she married this guy who was abusive as well. The midheaven and 10th houses pertaining to his mother, but also his professional life, his career, some of his highest priorities. So that first degree of Cancer also deals with him being the leader of the Mount Carmel compound, and also him competing for leadership, because that one breeds competition. Also, this points to a woman in a leadership position in government, and that points to Janet Reno's involvement, because she was Attorney General at the time, and she was the one who granted the ATF's use of the gas that created that fire. Also, this deals with David Koresh taking a child bride. So his wife Rachel was 14 when he married her. Again, that's, you know, inappropriate, but Texas law at the time stated that it was a legal marriage because the age of consent was 14. But I find this interesting because it shows that he was mirroring his mother, who got pregnant with him at 14. And when you have Cancer on the midheaven, there could be some mirroring going on in terms of your mother's life. So the moon in Aquarius ruling that 10th house is in the 5th, and that points to separation from his mother and also his mother's boyfriends. Also, that points to the communal type of living arrangements being in that compound. And that compound at one time, it housed about 100 members. Moon opposition Mercury. Again, the quote where it says, lonely and miserable, he dropped out of high school at the age of 17 and joined his mother's church, the Seventh-day Adventist group. And remember, Uranus is at the 17th degree of Leo and is conjoined to Mercury, and both are opposing the moon. So that points to that. Now let's make our way to the 5th house. So he has 3 degrees of Aquarius on the 5th house cusp, and that can produce a huge sense of entitlement in love affairs. Also, him being part of a fringe religious group and him leading that group. Saturn, co-ruler of the 5th house, at 0 degrees Capricorn in the 3rd. So that can produce an opportunistic approach towards romance, and that points to him getting with that leader, the leader's wife, I forget her name, Lois, that's her name, Lois Rodden, who was in her 70s when he started a romantic relationship with her, and it was so that he could take over leadership. So again, dating the older woman, the wife of the leader of the Branch Davidians, and believing that he should have a child with her to fulfill his destiny. Now, he later came out and said that, you know, it wasn't his intention to have a child with her. How could she possibly have a child, her being that age? But he might have mentioned that in communication with somebody at some point. And he was delusional with that Mercury square Neptune. Also, self-expression is tightly controlled, and some of this could be due to the government's involvement. Expresses self in a controlling, degrading, devilish, and even sadistic manner at times. Uranus, co-ruler of that 5th house, 17th degree Leo in the 11th. So this reinforces the children and love themes, albeit with elements of detachment, perversions, objectification, entitlement, tyranny. And that 17th degree deals with authority, control, and punishment based upon spiritual ideology, in his case, and believing that he is special or the chosen one. So again, here's that 5th house with the moon and Chiron. And there's something about 12 children. So he ended up having 12 children with different women. So that moon at the 12th degree points to that. And 12 is also the number of sacrifice, victimization. And both was going on with the siege upon the compound. So moon at 12 degrees Aquarius in the 5th house, a group of women, objectification of women, sense of entitlement towards women, a communal approach to love based on religious teaching. That 12 has a lot to do with religion because it corresponds to Jupiter and Sagittarius. But also, like I said, he had 12 children by different women. Again, this opposition resurfaces with the moon opposing Mercury and Uranus. This is him feeling entitled to other men's women / wives, him being a dictator over followers / members. Moon quincunx Venus. Issues with immodesty. So he was constantly changing up the code of conduct and the dress code because I guess he felt like the women weren't being modest enough. Attempts to keep these women in line, inability to form normal/healthy relationships with women due to deep-seated insecurities. That's that Venus in Virgo creating the insecurities, stemming from abandonment issues. That's Venus in the 12th house. And again, that quincunx is showing the changes he was making to the code of conduct for his members. And I believe from what some of the members said, it would just get increasingly more and more stringent. Moon trine North Node, I already spoke about this, but just to reiterate, his ability to marry multiple women, also Koresh having magnetic pull over people, attracting followers who adore him, but also social experiment led by government. So again, I wonder if this was just a way for the government to assert more of their power and use the Branch Davidians as an example of what not to do unless you want to get raided, unless you want to be taken out by the ATF because you are stockpiling weapons and you have these ultra right-wing religious beliefs. Chiron in the 5th house, 25 degrees Aquarius. This is pointing to him being a leader of an unconventional spiritual group, offshoot of Seventh-day Adventists, and the Seventh-day Adventists alone are a fringe Christian group. So just being part of the Seventh-day Adventists, that fits that Chiron. Abstaining from certain pleasures, and that's what the Seventh-day Adventists demand, and also the Branch Davidians as well. Sun opposition Chiron, lacking love and concern for children's welfare. Now, he did mention during the siege that he did try to tell the ATF, and they're like, there's children in here. But my thoughts is he could have been surrendered on behalf of the safety of the children, but he didn't. But he did allow some children to be released, because I think it was like 12 hostages, not hostages because they were members, they were voluntarily there. But I think it was about 12 people. That could be that moon at the 12th degree. 12 of the Branch Davidian members were released during the siege. Perverted ideas about love. Again, an experiment. And with him not being able to exercise his own free will, getting caught up in this experiment. So again, the FBI has had a list of people that could be threats over the years. That includes, right-wing groups. The Black Panthers was one of the more well-known groups where the FBI infiltrated. So the FBI, the government, has a history of infiltrating groups that they see as threats, even if there's really no real threat. Jupiter square Chiron, perverted or unconventional religious teachings, being ousted from the church twice, 2 different churches, sexual perversions, immoral, sudden death, mass deaths, unnerving, unsettling, pushing buttons. So in Koresh's case, he was pushing the buttons of the ATF, and they dealt with him as a result. 11th house. So the 3rd degree of Leo is on the 11th house cusp, and that 3rd degree deals with religion and him being a religious leader of a group and also a fringe group in particular. Mercury is in the 11th house, 7th degree of Leo. And that 7th degree deals with the 7 Seals manuscript, but I think I have that written down somewhere else. Mercury is conjoined to Acellus Borealis, which is a fixed star that promotes patience, beneficence, and courage. And it deals with a heroic and defiant leader. Isn't that interesting? Because that's exactly what David Koresh was to some people. Definitely defiant. Some people saw him as heroic, his members in particular, but also people that are very much about maintaining their right to bear arms. Mercury conjoined to Acellus Australis. This deals with military preferment, but also blindness, eye trouble, and again, he wore glasses. It also can manifest as mass murder and horrors. Can make one self-willed and uncooperative. Mercury was opposing the Arabic part of fatality. This is Koresh being the chosen one for the experiment, results in his fatality. Again, the government experiment, or you could say the government exercise, making an example out of him, and he's the one that has to die because, again, government has to will control. So again, while I am seeing David Koresh as being perverted, also being a religious zealot and being delusional in that respect, like feeling like he's the chosen one and being narcissistic, I don't believe the response from the ATF was warranted. This was totally out of line, the response by the government. So again, believing he has no choice but to follow the will of God. And he also mentioned that he knew that he was going to become a martyr. So when you have Mercury opposition to Arabic part of fatality, it's like you feel like you don't have no choice but to go along with what your fate demands, or basically, you know that, you know, you're going to die at some point and you're just going along with the script, I guess. His sun at 23 degrees Leo in the 11th house. At age 23, he started to rise in power through the branch Davidians by getting with the wife of the leader that died. So again, 23rd degree can deal with being highly favored, but also him having multiple wives, because 3 deals with abundance or a lot, and 2 deals with the wives. Great command of speech. And also he took a multicultural approach. In the video clip, you'll see that there was Black people there, and I think there was some Asians and also some Hispanics among white members. Sun conjunct Uranus. This can cause him to be extremely willful, but it does just point to him being a group leader, especially since his conjunction is in Leo, but also where he had the potential to be a tyrant, dictator. Also points to him being weird, odd, unique, eccentric. Also, this points to the fringe group and a communal approach to life, especially when you take into account that Uranus is ruling that 5th house, and this can deal with just having these different children. Sun conjunct Pluto. Influential, powerful, controlling, could be controlled or influenced by others, corruption, jealousy, hatred, obsessive, and there could be some demonic attachment going on, or where David Koresh is battling his personal demons. Sun opposition Chiron, painful separations, believing he has a special calling or mission, creating an offshoot of the branch Davidians, chaos ensues. Sun conjunct the fixed star Subra. Subra deals with strength, but also plunder, swagger, yet simple and without guile. Sun conjunct Arabic part of Brethren. This is basically just dealing with him being the leader of the branch Davidians. So here's his chart, 11th house heavily populated. Makes sense because he was the leader of that group. Pluto, 3rd degree Virgo in the 11th house. That 3rd degree deals with religion. And with Virgo, that could deal with a religion that's very strict, where you're expected to be pious, where you're being told how to dress, how to just operate in terms of your daily life. Even like health situations is dictated by the religion. The dress code, all of that goes into play. Pluto, contra parallel Lilith. This is him being a pariah, a rebel, but also it's representative of some of the wives that broke free or that went against him or that refused to be under his control. Pluto contra parallel Siwa. This is him spreading his seed as part of his religious duty, because Siwa deals with fertility. Pluto parallel Al-Heka. Al-Heka is a fixed star that pertains to honors, wealth, power, greed, and aggression. Now let's get into that 6th house. So he has the 4th degree of Pisces on the 6th house cuts, and this can deal with a group of devoted servants, spiritual collectivism, secret experiment, again, carried out by the government, serving a secret society, living in isolation. Jupiter co-ruler, that 6th house in Scorpio in the 2nd. Sexual service, so having his members be in sexual service to him, the female members, wielding total control over servants, susceptible to demonic possession and attachment, especially with Neptune in the second, Neptune and Scorpio in the second house, sex slaves perhaps, but they were thinking that they were doing their religious duty by sleeping with David Koresh, lacking sexual boundaries, drunk with power over his subjects.
On Sunday, April 18th, Janet Reno approved the CS assault plan and told President Bill Clinton of her decision. The remaining Branch Davidian cars on the compound were destroyed and moved that day in preparation so the tanks could move freely during the assault. A false sense of confidence was granted that evening to the Davidians when negotiators delivered more milk and a typewriter ribbon for Koresh to continue his Seven Seals manuscript, something the FBI knew he wouldn't have a chance to do. The next morning, at 6 a.m. on April 19th, the gas assault started. The negotiators called in to explain what was happening and that they could come out peacefully. In response, Steve Schneider ripped the phone from the wall and smashed it against the front door. The barrels of CS gas arrived, but the chemical came in powder form and needed to be mixed with a liquid. The liquid chosen was methylene chloride, another highly flammable compound that is also lethal. You may know it by its other name, paint stripper. The delivery method chosen was to use tanks to poke holes in vital parts of the building, tearing some sections down entirely, and pump the deadly mixture inside. Over the next 6 hours, they filled the compound. The Branch Davidians tried to fire back and defend themselves, but it was useless against the heavily armored tanks. They tried to create Molotov cocktails with the gas they had left, in hopes to use it when the compound was finally breached, only adding more flammables to the hellish conditions within. They attempted to protect themselves from the massive amounts of gas surging into their home from multiple areas by strapping on gas masks. Unfortunately, these were useless for the children inside, as they were too large to seal against their small faces. The children were rushed to the underground bunker in an attempt to avoid exposure, but the thermal imagery being used by law enforcement planes above meant there was nowhere to hide. Gas began being pumped into the bunker from above before a tank rolled over it and crumbled the concrete roof down on top of those inside, killing many children within. As the tanks moved around the compound, the FLIR, or forward-looking infrared cameras on the planes above, captured what looked like gunfire coming from agents on top of the tanks and in other spots around the building. The tanks tore into the gym, not to poke holes, but to destroy the structure entirely, maiming and viciously killing those within with their tank treads, something that can be seen from later autopsies that identified large portions of their bodies ripped away. One piece even jammed the tread of a tank, requiring a combat engineering vehicle to tow the tank away. And in a final act of malice or incompetence, the FBI fired incendiary gas canisters using a grenade launcher into the structure, as if it needed any more gas. The more conspiratorial among us might wonder if it was actually the incendiary mechanism that they were after, because the caustic mixture of flammables inside went ablaze. These canisters were fired from near the tanks, which set at least one of their gas pumps on fire. Several of these gas grenades with an incendiary mechanism were found expended within the compound's rubble afterwards. According to the local fire marshal, the several holes that had been torn in the compound served as air tunnels to quickly intensify the fire, like a potbelly stove. It was a windy day, and in his opinion, without flammables at all, even the smallest fire within would spread rapidly out of control and be nearly impossible to extinguish. And that's exactly what happened. The fire burned as the media looked on in horror from 2 miles away through their telephoto lenses. A few people managed to scamper out on the right side of the building. They were burnt, but alive. The fire raged on, and it looked like there was no way anybody else would survive. But then there was a moment of relief, as reporters saw 20 to 30 people exiting the building.
What we know is on the flip side that there are between 25 and 30 survivors.
With our long-range camera, we did see some people scurrying out. We couldn't tell how many. It was shortly after that that we heard that there were 20 people who had come out. It was after that that we heard from the Justice Department over the wires that they were saying there were only 8. They are probably being careful and understating things for the beginning. Let's hope so.
What they couldn't see from their angle And what the FLIR camera above could was what looked suspiciously like two men shooting in the direction of the people coming out. But at least one of them heard it. And maybe you can too. One another. As a final fuck you to the Branch Davidians, they replaced the Branch Davidian flag that burnt off the flagpole with an ATF flag. As the fire burned itself out and came to a whimper, the FBI's tanks were used to push all the debris into the center like a massive fire pit. A gross dereliction of duty, as this was clearly destruction of evidence and the most egregious contamination of a crime scene that one could imagine. 81 Branch Davidians would die on April 19, 1993. The 9 people that managed to escape were grabbed by authorities, treated on the spot, and arrested. They, and many of the other people that came out of the compound during the 51 days, would receive between 5 and 40 years. The official story given was that over the 51 days, not a single FBI agent fired a shot, and no ATF agents fired from the helicopters during the initial raid. And on the final conclusion, it was the Branch Davidians who set the fire within, and those that didn't die from the fire committed suicide. But there's a few oddities to this story. Many autopsies show death by blunt force trauma, body mutilation, or gunshots to the torso, and many of these come out in the House investigation of the Waco siege in 1995.
All right, let's move over to the 12th house. So he had the 4th degree of Virgo in the 12th house cusp, and that deals with a group of spiritual servants or disciples. Also serving a secret society, again, not in the classical sense, but they were an isolated group. And again, the secret society in this case could be the ATF and their nefarious plans to stamp out David Koresh and his followers, the Branch Davidians. Again, the main issue was he was stockpiling weapons. And I believe that the government wanted to send a message to the American public that that's not the way to go, even though we're supposed to live in a free country and we have the right to bear arms. So again, clandestine military operations, psyops, unrealistic kooky with dietary dictates. Mercury, 7 degrees Leo in the 11th house. So Mercury is ruling that 12th house. Like I said, it rules the 9th and the 12th house. And this deals with him being delusional in terms of believing he is the chosen one. King David delusions, leader of a spiritually pious group. And this is dealing with the 7 seals of the Apocalypse manuscript, with Mercury representing the manuscript and the 7th degree representing the 7 seals. So again, during the siege, he insisted upon writing this manuscript and reading it via a broadcast. And that was one of the negotiating terms, one of the negotiations. And then that plan fell through because the authorities, they didn't broadcast his reading of the manuscript at the time that he specified. They did it in the morning, so the Branch Davidians didn't even hear the manuscript being broadcasted, so they thought that the ATF went back on their word. There was just a lot of miscommunication going on during those 51 days. So here's his chart. Again, we covered all his houses. So now we're going to get into the transits that he was dealing with on the first day of the siege, February 28th, and then on the final day, April 19th. Oh, but also let me talk about Venus and Mars in the 12th first. I got a little ahead of myself. So Venus at the 15th degree of Virgo in the 12th house. 15th degree can result in being loved and adored, and it can result in benefiting through relationships. But 15th degree can also manifest as manipulation. Now, this is also dealing with the fact that he got a 15-year-old girl pregnant. I think he was maybe like 19 at the time. and he was cut out of the child's life. So he was never able to be a father to that child. And that moon quincunx Venus has a lot to do with it. Venus conjunct Mars. This conjunction can produce one-sided relationships. And because this conjunction's in Virgo, these relationships are based upon service and duty. Also, he was very mechanically inclined. He was very handy. He knew how to fix stuff, put stuff together. He was very helpful, but also very particular about things, nitpicky and uptight. And he was dealing firearms. And that's also where the whole secret operations, clandestine operations, because either him or one of the other guys he was selling firearms with, they could have had some type of deal with the ATF. And again, there were some reports about a couple of the guys having access to the ATF's computer files where they were keeping abreast upon everything that the ATF was doing. Trained and instructed people on how to shoot. So Virgo deals with training and instructing. Mars deals with firearms, and Venus deals with other people. Also, this deals with him being shot in the abdomen, with Virgo ruling the abdomen. So he was shot on the side of his abdomen during the siege. And at one point, he requested some stitches so that he could get stitched up. So here are the transits that was taking place on February 28th, 1993. The inner wheel is his natal chart. The outer wheel is the transit chart. So transiting Saturn was squaring his Jupiter. And some of these descriptions or possible manifestations I have taken from my book on planetary transits that I'm getting very close to finishing. I only have like how many? I only have like 90, maybe 92 entries left. And that's compared to how much I had before, which was like 300 and something. So I'm getting down to the last wire with it. So be patient with me. I will finish this book hopefully this year. Actually, I'm going to make it a point to finish it this year, publish it next year. So transiting Saturn square Jupiter, a lack of faith. So he could have been questioning his faith at that point, or maybe his faith was a little shaky, or there could have been an issue with somebody basically trying to break his faith. And again, that could have been the ATF blaring this music and these sounds, really trying to shake his confidence and all that. Also, the dispelling of a belief, breaking free from religious indoctrination. So that could be some of the members that were released. Restrictions are placed upon your freedom, an inability to move forward, a turn of fortune for the works, a need to stave off an overflow, facing retribution, revocation of a right or privilege, a need to be more disciplined or reserved, dealing with a problem regarding the justice system. So transiting Pluto was conjoined to his Jupiter, and Pluto was retrograde at the time. So this can deal with the final judgment, being forced to face the truth, the removal of freedoms or rights, being under tremendous pressure, death is magnified, a major crisis, going all out, a big explosion, major destruction, mayday or a distress signal, a major cover-up, desperation, renouncing your faith, the strengthening of faith, the great reckoning, being in great danger, an invasion, a life or death decision, being forced out. The transiting nodes were in Sagittarius and Gemini, and they were squaring Mars. So with this, he could be given a raw deal or feel like he was given a raw deal, an issue involving a male of significance, being outnumbered or overpowered, interpersonal conflict, being put on the defensive, challenges with being authentic, anger, ire, a frustrating situation, lacking energy or drive, losing momentum, an inability to move forward, being singled out, coercion, a daunting task, an inability to surmount an obstacle on your own, an external threat, your back is up against the wall, being pressured to act, feeling feverish, a period of inactivity, being forced to begin again, lacking strength, a harmful substance that could have been the gas that happened later, because this actually, the transiting nodes, by the time the siege was about to be over, they were squaring his Venus next. So back in February, the transiting nodes were squaring Mars, and then later in April, they were squaring his Venus. So some of these same themes will apply. An irritant causes a rash, an injury to the head or face. Cutting off your nose despite your face, an event triggers a fight or flight response. Dissatisfaction, being indignant, a need to alter your mode of operation. So the transiting north node was in Sagittarius, south node in Gemini. Transiting Mars was making a sesqui square with his Chiron. So some of this aspect can produce going to extremes, an odd experience, unforeseen challenges, a physical injury, acute pain, being besieged, being badgered, prodded, harsh treatment, abrasiveness, being assailed, being hit where it hurts, a significant downturn or setback, feeling discouraged, corrective action, punitive measures, a bully, being berated, limitations, severity, insensitivity, tyranny, one thing after another, feeling that you've hit rock bottom, devastation, degeneration, quarantine, feeling beat down, having a defeatist mentality, facing allegations or accusations. A lot of this applies to what was going on with David Koresh that day and the Branch Davidians. Being antagonized, ostracizing, a maniacal person, cruelty, desperate measures, being upset, enmity, extreme willfulness, losing it, cracking under pressure, overreacting, acting out, an irrevocable decision, being burnt, animosity, a permanent rift or separation, no signs of reconciliation, meanness, an action is thwarted by an outside force, not being prepared for an unforeseen disaster, being hounded, harassed, a nervous breakdown, distress, being at your breaking point, offenses. So here's the transit chart again. Transiting Venus quincunx Mars. And you can see Venus in the 7th house, that's like them having to face off with an enemy. And in this case, this was the ATF. So taking a means justify the ends perspective or approach, being protective over what is yours, disregarding someone's input or advice, not being true to yourself, refusing help or assistance, insisting upon doing things your way, demanding compliance, refusing to compromise, not being concerned with how your actions affect others, excising the extraneous, cordoning off an area, dissension amongst the ranks, excluding someone, the dissolution of a group or band. So here's the transits that took place on the last day of the siege. So as you can see, there's more activity in the 7th house now, and he's still dealing with a transit of the nodes, but now it's squaring Venus. Pluto's still hovering around his Jupiter. Chiron is in an exact conjunction with his Uranus. So transiting Chiron conjunct Uranus, both at the 17th degree, displaying extreme willfulness, a violent or bloody rebellion, going into attack mode, an uprising, refusing to compromise or concede, chaos, a nerve-wracking situation, dissension within a group, unexpected disruption, damage to the veins or arteries, being wounded, especially the ankle or lower leg. Now, that may not have applied to him, but that is a possible manifestation. Being wounded by a flying projectile, that definitely happened with him. And in this case, the flying projectile was a bullet. An experiment that involved some pain or damage, an air raid, creating a stir, being stirred up, a shocking or unsettling situation, going your own way, taking extreme measures, a knee-jerk reaction, a painful separation, being ousted or forced out. Transiting Pluto conjunct Jupiter again. So that transit was still in effect. I believe it was even closer. The final judgment, doomsday for Koresh. being forced to face the truth, the great reckoning, the removal of freedoms or rights, being under tremendous pressure, desperation, death is magnified, a major crisis, going all out, a big explosion, major destruction, mayday/distress signal, a major cover-up, renouncing your faith or the strengthening of faith, being in great danger, an invasion, a life or death decision, being forced out in the open. Pluto was squaring his sun, being under a great deal of pressure, being forced out, death is looming, being in crisis, infiltration, intrusion, the suppression of the will, receiving negative attention, being the target of a smear campaign, a tarnished image, being a victim of a crime, being besieged, the purge, being tortured, being tormented, destruction, being on edge, the death or murder of children, demonic attacks. Basically, the ATF and the FBI, they were playing the role of the demons during this siege, and especially on the last day. Succumbing to manipulative tactics, an act of desperation, a do or die situation, a cover-up, subterfuge, subjugation, being stamped out, a dark period of one's life, actions are quelled, no way out, being forced to give in or surrender, succumbing to a sense of futility. And the transing nodes were squaring Venus, like I said before, not being in agreement with a mandate or dictate, a blow to your self-esteem, financial insecurity, or just insecurity, period. Your safety is in jeopardy, a security issue arises. Also, this transit deals with the fact that they were limited in terms of food, especially milk. So at one point, milk and water, because the ATF blew up their water tank, and then they started running out of milk for the kids. So that was one of the bargaining tools. David Koresh asked them to deliver some milk for the kids. Not being receptive, having difficulty adapting to a new situation, displeasure, discontent, backing out of an agreement, a need to be more guarded, a need to reduce the amount of food you eat or make changes in food choices. So again, the milk situation. And what else we got? Transiting Jupiter to join to the North Node. This is representing the negotiations because of the Libra theme. Experiencing the hand of fate, Judgment Day, a unanimous decision, and that could have been with the Branch Davidians. Transiting Mars was forming a quincunx with his Chiron. So this can produce a day out of the ordinary, an interruption in the normal course of events, having to do what's necessary for yourself, even if that creates an inconvenience for others. Nope, can't do it. Experiencing a sharp or piercing pain, being wounded, having to work out unforeseen kinks, contingencies. Here we go again. An event hits you like a ton of bricks, vexed, shocked, startled. A man brings some shocking news. A man displaying unusual behavior. Going against the grain. An out-of-the-box solution is needed. Anarchy. Being on the receiving end of discrimination or prejudice. Being shut out. A need to beef up security. A security breach. Seeing the stark reality of a situation, bucking the system, refusing to go along or join the crowd, railing against a policy, procedure, or standard. So transiting Mercury, Venus, the moon, and ascendant were conjoined to the Aries South Node. So he was dealing with some heavy Arian transits on that day, and Aries rules gunfire and fires. So activation of past life tendency to be warlike with these transits on his South Node and the gunfire. Attack, defense, transiting moon, Venus, Mercury, and ascendant opposing the Libra ascendant. The standoff, being at war, trading gunfire, using strategy, the negotiations. And that's basically it for this case study. So let me know what you think in the comments section. Hope you found it to be insightful and enlightening. And again, I just want to say, while I believe that David Koresh was a narcissist, was, a little schizo, was twisted in terms of his religious beliefs and philosophy, I don't believe that he was a threat to basically anybody. Maybe these under 8, the 14-year-old or whatever, he probably would have got another wife, but it seemed like he still was trying to operate within the law. Even though, you know, his ideas, again, were very twisted. So I don't believe that the ATF and the FBI were justified in the siege. And I believe that this was the US government's attempts to send a message to the American people that stockpiling weapons and having certain right-wing radical views will result in being taken out and taken down. And I saw this documentary about Ruby Ridge last night, and that was another situation where the ATF killed this guy's wife and his 13-year-old son, and they were very much about living off the land, and they had a lot of weapons, and they were very religious, and they believed in the end times, especially with the government being very oppressive. And they took his wife out, and they took his 13-year-old son out and their dog, and it was totally unwarranted. So this document, the guy that did the documentary, the same guy that I included the clips, because he did a documentary on David Koresh, he was saying that he believes that this was the ATF's attempts to prove themselves or to clean up their image from the Ruby Ridge attacks. And I'm like, what a way to like try to clean up your image by making things even worse. But again, that kind of goes along the lines of what I was saying, where this was like a government exercise to basically show that, yeah, the United States is a force to be reckoned with. And basically they flex their military muscle and might to stamp out David Koresh because he was on the fringes of society. And they look at people like him as dangerous because he was also attracting quite a few members, and they wanted to squash that before it got out of hand. So hopefully you enjoyed this case study. Thanks again to Kauai Honey for sponsoring it. I learned a lot about David Koresh and the whole Waco situation, and I'm just shaking my head at the lengths that these government agencies went to in order to take this man out, and some of the Branch Davidians. Because like it said in the video clip, they could have easily arrested him while he was out jogging every morning, but they chose to attack the whole compound. Well, all right, that's it for now. Please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And also, if you would like a reading, you could go to my website. The link is in the description section. And I'll be back soon with some more videos and a live stream. Stay tuned. Peace and many blessings.